The humid nights of Florida in the late 70s carried a strange electricity in the air, a tension that most residents dismissed as nothing more than seasonal unease. But those who worked the late shifts, bartenders, night shift patrol officers, small-town reporters, often felt something else lingering beneath it, a quiet pressure that made them glance more than once into rearview mirrors. In 1978, that feeling had no name, no form, no explanation. Not yet. But the first hints of a pattern were already beginning to take shape in the unnoticed corners of boxing gyms, local newspapers and police reports that would eventually be collected into a case that investigators would later describe as one of the most psychologically unusual of the period. It began in Jacksonville, though the story does not truly belong to any single city. Florida in the 1970s was a patchwork of transient highways, motel corridors, arenas hosting mid-card boxing events, and long coastal stretches where young athletes drifted between hope and exhaustion. The state had built a reputation for producing fighters who burned brightly and fast, men who carried within them a complicated mixture of ambition, pride, and quiet fear of failure. They fought under sodium lights in local venues, their names occasionally making the sports pages, only to fall quickly back into obscurity. One of those names was Evan Delacroix, name altered, 27 years old, once considered a rising welterweight prospect before suffering a decisive loss in a televised bout that was meant to revive his career. For most viewers, Evan was just another contender who had stumbled at the wrong time. But for one observer, someone who would remain invisible for years, Evan's defeat marked him as something else entirely, a candidate. Investigators would later determine that the unidentified man who had begun shadowing these defeated boxers was following a ritualistic psychological framework rather than any practical motive. He was drawn specifically to fighters who had lost high-stakes matches, bouts that defined their trajectory. An obsession with disappointment, inadequacy, and public collapse. Those themes repeated themselves across the files. But these conclusions would come much later. In 1978, all anyone knew was that Evan had left his small apartment on a warm Thursday evening and never returned. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office handled his disappearance like any other adult missing person case of the era. Minimal leads, brief interviews with neighbors, a note in a manila folder. Florida law enforcement at the time had no unified database for pattern linking. Cases were stored in boxes, filed by county, forgotten until something larger forced them to resurface. Evan's case would join 3 others, each occurring in different parts of the state, each involving boxers whose careers had collapsed after key defeats, but no one made that connection then. What investigators missed at the time was a witness statement filed near Pensacola, a mechanic who reported seeing a dark green 1973 Dodge Tradesman van idling near a local boxing gym late at night. The description was vague, common for the period, nothing distinctive enough to draw attention. Tradesman vans were everywhere in Florida, used by contractors, landscapers, drifters, and traveling athletes, but the detail would later be marked with red ink as one of the earliest clues pointing toward the perpetrator. Throughout the 1980s, Florida's boxing culture went through a quiet transformation. Gyms became community hubs, attracting young fighters desperate for opportunity. Journalists in Orlando, Tampa, and Miami covered regional matches that rarely reached national headlines. Defeat in one of those bouts rarely made a fighter newsworthy for long, but for the person watching from the sidelines, defeat itself was the trigger. The second man to disappear, Luis El Rapido Mendieta, name altered, was 32, a Cuban-American lightweight whose career had collapsed after a controversial split decision in Miami Beach in 1981. He had trained in Hialeah, a neighborhood where sweat, debt, and pride mixed together in the gyms, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. Luis was known for his speed, his stubborn resilience, and the pressure he put on himself to prove he deserved another shot at prominence. When he disappeared after a late-night conditioning session, most assumed he had simply walked away from the sport. Fighters did that often, some after a loss, others out of exhaustion, but those close to him insisted he had seemed on the brink of rebuilding, not quitting. A janitor from the gym later recalled a detail he had initially dismissed: a tall man leaning against a column in the parking lot, watching the athletes leave. He didn't approach anyone. He didn't speak. He only observed. When asked to describe him, The janitor said the man had an unremarkable face, a phrase that investigators would repeat in their profiles years later. Someone who didn't attract attention. Someone who knew how to blend into Florida's anonymous crowds of workers, tourists and transients drifting between coastal towns. The third disappearance, the one that finally caused the first ripple of concern across local departments, occurred in 1984 and involved Marcus Brass Jaw Carter, name altered. 29, a heavyweight contender whose knockout loss in Tampa was replayed repeatedly in sports segments for a week. The humiliation had been public, amplified by slow-motion replays broadcast across local channels. Marcus had been a crowd favorite, a charismatic figure with a quick sense of humor. When he vanished 2 weeks after that decisive loss, a few of his close acquaintances spoke openly to reporters, suggesting that depression from the defeat might have driven him to leave town. But the disappearance of 3 boxers over less than a decade, each after a major loss, was not something the public recognized as unusual. Florida's geography and transient population blurred patterns. Many men disappeared during that time. Travelers, seasonal workers, and athletes who moved from gym to gym in hopes of finding new opportunities. And because no one had yet linked the van sightings, the observers, or the precise timing of the disappearances, there was no sense of urgency. In Tallahassee, a young criminology student named Richard Hale, name altered, then 24, would later become one of the first voices advocating for a statewide review of missing athletes. But in the 80s, Hale was still years away from joining law enforcement, years away from convincing anyone in authority that these cases were connected. When he eventually succeeded, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement would discover a pattern so psychologically distinct that it became a case study taught in multiple academies. For now, however, the story remained buried in boxes, dismissed as coincidence. The fourth victim, Daniel Southbound Price, name altered, disappeared in 1986 near Daytona Beach. He had lost a decisive match that had been marketed as his last shot at redemption, a storyline newspapers and local promoters loved. After the fight, reporters captured his expression as he walked back to the locker room. Numb, rigid, a man wrestling with something inside himself. The footage would later be re-examined by investigators and psychologists seeking signs that Daniel had been targeted. But there was no clear evidence, only a sense of foreboding that grew stronger as analysts reviewed it in the context of later events. The fifth disappearance would become the turning point, though no one recognized it at the time. In 1988, Anthony Rivera, name altered, 26, a promising junior middleweight with a disciplined style, suffered a technical defeat in Orlando. He vanished 1 week later. What made Rivera's case different was not the pattern, it was the witness. A motel clerk reported seeing Rivera speaking briefly with a man next to a dark green Dodge tradesman van, the same model mentioned years earlier in Pensacola. At the time, the detail was added to a small report and filed. No detective connected it to the older sightings. Looking back, investigators would describe the 80s as the decade of missed opportunities in this case. Leads were present, but scattered. Witnesses observed unusual behavior, but no one stitched the fragments together. The killer himself seemed to understand this. His movements were deliberate, subtle, and timed around public events that provided natural cover for his presence. Boxing matches drew crowds from all over the state. Gyms saw hundreds of athletes come and go. Vans, particularly tradesmen's, were so common that no one questioned their presence in a parking lot or outside a venue. But beneath the surface of these ordinary details lay something deeper, a pattern built not on the logistics of opportunity but on the psychology of collapse. Later analysis would reveal that the perpetrator attended multiple fights, watching the defeated boxers with an attentiveness that blended into the noise of spectatorship. His fixation was not on aggression but on vulnerability, specifically the moment when a fighter's self-belief fractured under the weight of public failure. Defeat created a psychological opening he seemed to interpret as destiny. Florida in the late 80s was entering a new era of organized crime control, interagency cooperation, and shifting investigative techniques. But the pattern remained invisible until the early 90s, when new leadership within the FDLE began retroactively analyzing old missing person cases. Boxes were opened, files were compared. Notes from Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, Daytona, and Pensacola were laid out on long tables. One phrase reappeared across multiple documents: recent loss in decisive bout. Another repeated detail: tradesman van seen nearby. And among the personal statements from family and gym members, descriptions of a quiet man watching from a distance. By the time the 90s began, the groundwork for discovering the pattern had been laid. All that remained was for someone to connect the psychological dots. And that connection was about to be made. By 1990, a quiet shift had begun inside the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. A new deputy director, Frank Douglas, name altered, 46, was pushing for modernization, digitization of old files, standardized case categorization, cross-county data alignment. What most officers viewed as tedious administrative work, Douglas saw as essential preparation for uncovering patterns long buried under paper and dust. He believed Florida's transient nature hid more serial offenders than anyone realized. His concern was not paranoia but observation. Isolated cases in one county often mirrored unresolved reports from another. It was only a matter of time before one of these connections surfaced. That connection emerged through the work of a young analyst, Richard Hale, now 30, no longer a student theorizing from lectures but a newly appointed criminal data specialist. Hale had been the kind of trainee who filled entire notebooks with careful observations, someone who treated missing person forms like pieces of a puzzle. His interest in athletes, particularly fighters, came from his own short-lived amateur boxing years. He had competed in several regional tournaments before abandoning the sport after a shoulder injury. He understood the culture intimately. The silence of locker rooms after a loss, the shame that followed, the way fighters carried defeat like a weight that would not leave their backs for weeks. That understanding became the filter through which he viewed one of Florida's cold cases. The pattern first struck him while scanning through a stack of unresolved files from the 80s. One report mentioned a boxer leaving his gym after a critical loss. Another, filed years earlier, described a similar disappearance. Hale jotted a single note in red ink: defeat correlation? It was enough to make him search deeper. Over several days, he sorted through paper records from at least 5 counties, creating a crude timeline that stretched across 15 years. When he presented the initial findings to Douglas, the director leaned back in silence, recognizing that something larger might be unfolding. They expanded the search. Hale visited dusty archives in municipal buildings, retrieving boxes that had not been opened in years. He scanned microfilm reels for missing athletes, cross-referencing sports pages with police reports. Slowly, the pattern sharpened. Each missing boxer had suffered a defeat described as decisive, career-shifting, humiliating, or final. None had disappeared after victories, and nearly all had vanished within 2 weeks of their losses. The van sightings resurfaced next. Hale discovered one reference in a 1978 Jacksonville report, another in a Miami file, and a third in a Daytona Beach statement. 3 separate counties, 3 separate witnesses, but all describing a dark green Dodge tradesman. Hale drew a square around each occurrence, and then underlined them twice. That detail, common yet too consistent to ignore, would become the backbone of the eventual suspect profile. By early 1991, Douglas authorized an interdepartmental review. Detectives from Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, and Pensacola gathered in Tallahassee to discuss the possibility of a serial offender who had gone unnoticed for over a decade. Some remained skeptical. The disappearances spanned too many years, too many jurisdictions. Others pointed out that missing adult males, especially transient athletes, rarely drew the kind of investigative resources needed to connect them. But when Hale laid out the timeline on a whiteboard, 5 boxes, each vanishing after a major loss, each with at least one van sighting nearby, the skepticism weakened. The breakthrough came when Hale identified the 6th disappearance, one that had gone almost entirely unnoticed. Jorge Villalobos, name altered, 28, a Mexican-American featherweight, disappeared in 1990, just days after losing a decisive regional bout in St. Petersburg. His case had been filed as possible voluntary departure, a classification often used when families reported tension or instability. But Jorge's family insisted he had been determined to rebuild his career. When Hale reviewed the file, he found a note the reporting officer had scribbled in the margin. Green van. That made 4 independent sightings, spanning over a decade, always near boxing locations, always connected to a fighter who had recently been defeated. With 6 confirmed missing fighters and another pair of potential cases under review, the FDLE began constructing a psychological profile. A consulting forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Helen Porter, name altered, theorized that the perpetrator might be driven by a fixation on professional collapse. Not violence, not sport, not victory collapse. The moment when a fighter's internal structure shattered. She believed the killer was selecting individuals who embodied a very specific emotional state, one that blended hopelessness with a uniquely masculine vulnerability tied to public failure. Porter described the perpetrator as someone who likely drifted between Florida cities during fight seasons, someone who understood the sport intimately enough to recognize decisive losses, but not necessarily a former fighter, someone who watched from the margins, unnoticed in crowds, someone whose life circumstances might mirror disappointment or stagnation, fueling a predatory resentment. Her emphasis on psychological collapse matched Hale's timeline notes almost perfectly. The FDLE decision to elevate the investigation to a task force level came in midsummer of 1991. The case was formally named the Florida Fighter Disappearance Pattern, a placeholder title that would later be replaced by the media's far more dramatic version. But those headlines still lay years ahead. At this point, law enforcement was working with fragments. No bodies, no direct witnesses, only absence, defeat, and a van. While detectives pursued historical leads, the killer was continuing his pattern unnoticed. In early 1992, Rafael "Lightning Hands" Mendez, name altered, 31, was defeated in a decisive televised bout in Miami. He had been the favorite, predicted to win by a wide margin. When he suffered an unexpected technical loss, commentators spent minutes replaying the final round, analyzing mistakes and speculating about the psychological pressure he had carried into the ring. Within 8 days, he vanished. A gym receptionist recalled seeing a quiet, pale-eyed man in the lobby after closing, but could not provide details beyond that. Only weeks later, after Hale cross-referenced Mendez's loss with the broader timeline, did investigators add his name to the list. The escalation alarmed Douglas. Whoever the perpetrator was, he had adapted across decades, maintaining the same ritualistic criteria while avoiding detection. The consistency suggested not impulse, but methodology. And if the killer's selection depended on watching fights in person, investigators expected he might strike again soon. In fall of 1992, detectives deepened efforts to analyze the geography of the disappearances. They plotted the locations on a map, marked gym addresses, event venues, motels, and potential storage areas where a van could remain unnoticed. The map revealed something new. Most disappearances occurred near major highways, I-4, I-10, I-95, routes that allowed quick movement between cities. Detectives theorized the killer may have worked a job requiring travel or chosen to live nomadically. The van became not just a transport vehicle, but a moving base of operations. For the first time, investigators considered the possibility that the killer had kept trophies, receipts, ticket stubs, fight programs. Though speculative, the idea was consistent with the psychological pattern. The killer did not choose random victims. He selected athletes in moments of profound personal fracture. Memorabilia might have served as symbols of those fractures. The shift from retrospective analysis to active investigation began in 1993, when the FDLE instructed undercover officers to attend key boxing events. They carried discreet cameras, observed parking lots, and recorded van license plates. Hale developed a protocol for quickly flagging decisive losses so officers could monitor fighters who fit the pattern. The goal was not to stalk athletes, but to anticipate when the perpetrator might strike again. This approach, unusual for the era, pushed the FDLE beyond traditional policing. For the first time, Florida was approaching a serial offender case by studying psychological triggers rather than waiting for physical evidence. But even with these efforts, the killer remained invisible. Officers watched hundreds of spectators. They noted dozens of unremarkable men. None matched the vague descriptions from earlier sightings. The perpetrator had built a life of anonymity, moving through crowds without leaving memorable impressions. Then came the breakthrough lead. In March of 1994, a convenience store employee near Clearwater reported an unsettling encounter. A man driving a green Dodge Tradesman had asked for directions to a local boxing gym, insisting he needed to see if someone had come back after losing a fight. The phrasing was unusual enough that the employee noted the incident in a store log. Weeks later, when the FDLE distributed a statewide bulletin asking civilians to report tradesman vans near athletic facilities, the clerk contacted authorities and provided a partial license plate number. Hale immediately ran the numbers. The partial match produced 8 possible registrations across Florida. 7 were quickly ruled out. 1 remained. A van registered to Thomas Arlen, age 43, a maintenance worker employed by a private cleaning company that serviced event venues statewide. Arlen's job required him to travel frequently, often at night, often to arenas and gymnasiums. His work logs placed him at or near 3 venues on dates connected to fighter disappearances. When Hale presented the information to Douglas, a silent heaviness filled the room. After years of searching for fragments, a name had finally emerged. They had a suspect, they had a van, and the van had a schedule. Arlen's work routes were documented, predictable, and, crucially, aligned with the state's fight circuit. But as Douglas warned his team, the emergence of a suspect did not mean the case was near resolution. They had no physical evidence, no bodies, no definitive witness. Arlen's association with the events was circumstantial. The task force decided to initiate discreet surveillance rather than confront him immediately. They wanted to understand his routine, his movements, his habits, and whether the psychological profile matched the man. Thus began the most crucial phase of the investigation, the slow tightening of a net around a suspect who had eluded detection for nearly 2 decades. And that net was about to tighten even more. Surveillance on Thomas Arlen began quietly in the summer of 1994. Detectives rotated shifts to avoid revealing patterns, following the dull green tradesman van from venue to venue, warehouse to warehouse, across Florida's sun-bleached corridors. Arlen worked inconsistent hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, but his routes centered on arenas, multi-purpose centers, and small athletic facilities. The task force kept meticulous logs, noting where he parked, how long he stayed, and who he watched. Arlen himself remained unremarkable. Medium height, thinning brown hair, pale eyes that rarely met anyone else's. Surveillance notes repeatedly used the same descriptions. Quiet, blends in, routine-oriented. He wore the same beige work shirts, carried the same thermos, moved with the slow, deliberate steps of someone accustomed to being invisible. Officers observing him remarked that he fit the psychological profile almost too well, a man whose presence disappeared into the background, whose movements conveyed neither confidence nor distress. His habits, however, drew attention. He lingered near gyms, even when not scheduled to clean them. He sat in the back rows of small boxing venues long after crowds had left, hands folded on his lap, watching maintenance crews sweep floors. He often arrived early at events, sometimes over an hour before doors opened, positioning himself at vantage points where fighters passed through loading docks or secondary hallways. Investigators noticed that he avoided concession stands, avoided chatty spectators, and rarely touched anything unless necessary. He observed, always observed. The deeper the surveillance ran, the clearer the alignment with earlier case patterns. Arlen's van had been clocked near 5 gyms previously connected to disappearances. He frequented local matches, paying attention primarily to fighters who came off the ring with lowered heads and slumped shoulders. Though no officer witnessed direct contact between Arlen and a fighter, the proximity alone alarmed investigators. But surveillance alone could not justify an arrest. Douglas insisted on restraint, aware that premature action could force the suspect to flee or adjust his behavior. They needed a presence of opportunity, a moment where Arlen's movements intersected directly with a fighter who had recently suffered a decisive loss. That moment came unexpectedly. In October 1994, a regional boxing event in Kissimmee drew athletes from across the state. Among them was Gabriel "Hollow Step" Ruiz, name altered, 30, a veteran middleweight whose career had been eroding for years. Ruiz entered the bout desperate to reclaim his standing, but lost badly in the 7th round. A technical defeat that commentators described as the final confirmation that Ruiz had reached the end of the road. Cameras captured his grim expression as he left the ring, wiping sweat from his brow with the slow movements of a man processing the collapse of a lifelong ambition. Arlen was there, Surveillance officers had tracked the tradesman to the venue 2 hours before the event began. They watched as Arlen took a seat in the far corner of the bleachers, seemingly uninterested in the early matches. Only when Ruiz walked into the ring did Arlen lean forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked onto the fighter. When Ruiz fell to technical defeat, Arlen's posture stiffened. He remained seated even as spectators filed out, his gaze following Ruiz's departure through the back corridor. The task force held its breath. 2 officers shadowed Ruiz after the match, concerned he might unknowingly become the next target. Ruiz, exhausted and humiliated, walked alone to the parking lot, placing his gear in the trunk of a faded blue Oldsmobile. Arlen appeared minutes later, exiting the venue through a side door, pausing near the top step scanning the lot. Surveillance officers noted that he never approached Ruiz directly. Instead, he drifted along the fringes of the area, eyes fixed on the fighter, then returned to his van. It was not enough for an arrest, but it was undeniable evidence that the psychological pattern continued. Over the next 2 weeks, Ruiz became the reluctant center of a protective shadow operation. Officers monitored his training sessions, tracked his movements, kept watch outside his home. Meanwhile, Arlen made several unexplained detours across the state, often near gyms but without approaching anyone. The pattern was eerily familiar. The quiet movements, the lurking presence, the waiting. On November 3rd, Arlen did something new. Surveillance teams followed him to a small auto parts store outside Bartow. He parked, remained inside his van for almost 15 minutes, then entered the store. When he emerged, he carried a single item, a pack of replacement bulbs for dome lights, the kind used in older vans. Investigators made a note of it, but did not yet understand its significance. They would later. By mid-November, the FDLE prepared an operation to gather evidence more directly. They obtained a warrant for a GPS tracker to be installed on Arlen's van. The judge approved the request based on the long-standing pattern, witness reports, and his proximity to fighters after decisive losses. The tracker was installed in a supermarket parking lot during Arlen's shift inside a venue. From that moment on, the task force watched his movements with precision, and the movements told a story. Arlen drove a circuit through Florida that mirrored the boxing calendar. Orlando to Tampa, Tampa to Jacksonville, Jacksonville to Daytona, Daytona to Miami. He stopped in quiet neighborhoods, parked near gyms, and sometimes sat for hours in lots where trainers and fighters tended to gather. He never spoke to anyone in those areas. He simply watched. His van became a roaming symbol of anticipation. In December 1994, an unexpected opportunity emerged. A local fighter, Darren Brickpulse Maddox, name altered, 26, lost a decisive bout in Orlando, a defeat broadcast on regional television. The task force, anticipating that Arlen might target Maddox, began immediate monitoring around the fighter's home and training facility. Maddox, unaware of any danger, spoke to reporters after his loss, embracing the disappointment with forced optimism. Investigators noted his emotional state, defeated, but trying to mask it. 3 days later, Arlen's van appeared in a service alley behind the same training facility. Surveillance officers documented the moment with sharp anxiety. Arlen stepped out of the van, stood under a flickering streetlight, and stared at the back entrance to the gym. He remained there for several minutes. When Maddox exited the facility, accompanied by a trainer, Arlen turned away and returned to the van, leaving the scene silently. This time, investigators felt something shift. Arlen's proximity to a newly defeated fighter aligned too closely with the psychological profile. The task force began preparing for potential intervention, but the case did not hinge on Maddox, nor on Ruiz, nor on any of the fighters under indirect surveillance. Instead, the breakthrough came from an unexpected angle, a storage facility. On January 12, 1995, Arlen visited a self-storage complex north of Tampa. The GPS tracker recorded the stop, prompting 2 surveillance cars to follow. Arlen punched in a code, drove through the gate, and stopped at a unit near the back row. Investigators watched from a distance, concealed behind a line of abandoned trucks. Arlen opened the unit, rolled up the metal door, and stood motionless inside for almost 5 minutes before retrieving a cardboard box and placing it in his van. He then closed the unit, locked it, and drove away. Detectives contacted the facility manager, obtaining the rental records under judicial authorization. The unit had been rented by Arlen for nearly 14 years. Payments were made in cash. No listed emergency contacts, no secondary keys. The long-term nature of the lease combined with the lack of documentation raised immediate concerns. Douglas authorized a full search warrant. 2 days later, a team of investigators entered the storage unit. Inside, they found ordinary items, old tools, boxes of cleaning supplies, spare clothing. But in the far corner, beneath a tarp, were several shoeboxes containing what investigators later described as non-criminal memorabilia, ticket stubs, fight programs, newspaper clippings, all from fights in which the missing boxers had suffered decisive defeats. Each disappearance corresponded to at least one item in the collection. They had no bodies, no direct physical evidence. But what they found next shifted the investigation from suspicion to certainty. Inside a weathered cardboard box, sealed with brittle tape, investigators discovered a stack of personal belongings, hand wraps, gym membership cards, small notebooks containing training schedules. Some items were monogrammed, others had initials. All belonged to the missing fighters. The task force did not celebrate. Instead, a cold silence filled the room as they realized the magnitude of what they had uncovered. These items were more than trophies. They were anchors to the emotional states of the victims, reminders of their psychological vulnerability at the moments they had been targeted. And at the bottom of the box, investigators found a single photograph, a blurry image of a man standing near a van in a gravel lot. The man's face was turned away, but the posture matched Arlen's surveillance file precisely. This was enough, but the FDLE knew they had to move carefully. Arlen had operated undetected for nearly 2 decades. If confronted prematurely, he could vanish into the endless web of Florida highways. They needed to catch him in a moment of clarity, during a behavioral repetition, during the ritual. That opportunity was approaching, and investigators could feel it. The discovery inside the Tampa storage unit marked the first physical confirmation that law enforcement had not been chasing shadows. Every item in that darkened space pointed toward a long-term ritual, structured, obsessive, and intimately connected to the emotional collapse of the men he targeted. For investigators, the memorabilia revealed something chilling. The killer did not sever himself from the victims after their disappearances. He preserved echoes of their identities, their defeats, and perhaps the pieces of their lives that represented the vulnerability he sought. After the search, the task force convened in a quiet conference room in Tallahassee. Maps, surveillance logs, and photographs from the storage unit were pinned across the walls. A sense of gravity settled over the room. Even the most skeptical officers began acknowledging that they were dealing with a meticulous offender who had evolved undetected for nearly 20 years. Douglas, keeping his usual calm, outlined the next steps. Tighten surveillance, avoid confrontation until a clear behavioral trigger emerged, and prepare for the inevitable moment when the suspect would attempt to repeat his ritual. Hale, reviewing the memorabilia collected from the storage unit, noted a pattern within the pattern. Each box's belongings corresponded to the final days after their decisive losses, the period when they were emotionally vulnerable, drifting between self-reproach and forced resilience. The killer had selected objects tied to that fragile state. Hand wraps worn during training sessions after defeats, not before. Calendars with circled dates marking return routines that never happened. Membership cards from gyms they visited during the final week before they disappeared. It was as if the offender understood that their sense of identity was suspended during those moments, and he inserted himself within that fracture. Psychologists assisting the investigation remarked that the selection process indicated a profound familiarity not just with the sport, but with the psychological anatomy of failure. Public, masculine, humiliating failure. The killer seemed to identify more with the emotional collapse of these fighters than with their physicality. This was not about strength or combat. It was about broken ambition. By January 1995, Arlen remained unaware that investigators were watching every mile he drove. The GPS tracker revealed his patterns more clearly than any witness ever had. He followed cyclical paths through cities and towns that aligned almost perfectly with Florida's boxing calendar. If a fighter suffered a decisive loss in Orlando, Arlen drove through the area within days. If a match ended unexpectedly in Tampa, his van appeared within a week. Watching the map on the tracking monitor felt like viewing the heartbeat of a man who synchronized his life with the defeats of others. The task force decided to simulate the conditions under which Arlen typically acted. They identified upcoming decisive bouts and monitored fighters most likely to experience significant emotional fallout. The goal was not entrapment, it was anticipation. They needed to understand the sequence: observation, selection, approach, because only by observing the ritual in real time could they catch him with enough evidence for a conviction. The next key moment occurred on February 2, 1995. A high-stakes bout in Daytona Beach featured Terrence "Jawline" Mercer, name altered, 31, a seasoned fighter nearing the end of his career. Mercer had promised one final push toward relevance, declaring the upcoming match his last stand. When he suffered a crushing technical defeat, the expression on his face as he stepped down from the ring echoed the same expression investigators had seen in archived footage from the earlier victims: blank, interior, almost vacant. The cameras caught him staring at the ground in silence, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. Arlen was present at the venue. GPS data showed his van parked behind the arena 2 hours before the event began. Surveillance officers spotted him moving among the maintenance staff, blending in with the background just as he always had. During the fight, he took a seat in the upper bleachers. When Mercer began faltering in the later rounds, Arlen's posture shifted subtly, spine straightening, hands clasping tighter, eyes fixed on the ring. And when Mercer lost decisively, Arlen remained seated, unmoving, long after the crowd's noise had drained from the room. The tension in the surveillance team escalated. They followed Mercer closely in the days after the defeat. He trained quietly, isolated himself from friends, and attended physiotherapy sessions alone. The emotional collapse was evident. It was precisely the state the killer sought. But something changed in Arlen's behavior. Instead of approaching Mercer's home or gym directly, he circled the area repeatedly over several nights, parking in different lots, sometimes for hours. On one night, he sat in his van near a shuttered gas station, engine off, radio silent. When the task force observed him lean back in the driver's seat and stare blankly at a flickering streetlight, Hale noted that Arlen appeared to be deliberating, perhaps attempting to determine whether Mercer fit the exact psychological criteria he sought. This hesitation was unusual. It suggested that Arlen was weighing something deeper than opportunity. Investigators speculated that he preferred fighters whose emotional collapse appeared irreversible, not temporary. Mercer, while defeated, still seemed anchored by a sense of responsibility. He continued attending training sessions and speaking with his coach. That resilience may have placed him outside Arlen's preferred psychological pattern. The shift in behavior raised a troubling question. If Arlen did not select Mercer, then whom would he select next? The answer came weeks later. On March 19, 1995, in a modest venue outside Fort Myers, Leonard "Daybreak" Harlan, name altered, 29, lost a decisive bout that had been promoted as his last chance for a regional title. Harlan was a quiet fighter, respected but never celebrated. His defeat was not widely televised, but local reporters wrote about it with a tone of finality. The loss appeared to crush something in him. Witnesses noted that he left the venue alone, avoiding the locker room gathering, and sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, staring forward in silence. Arlen's van was seen in the area the next day. GPS logs showed his arrival at a strip mall across from Harlan's primary training gym. Surveillance officers captured him watching the facility from inside his vehicle, the midday heat turning the windshield into a reflective screen. He remained motionless for hours. When Harlan left the gym, limping slightly, Arlen started his van but did not follow. Instead, he drove in slow circles around the block, passing the gym repeatedly. This pattern, hover but do not approach, suggested an internal evaluation process. Investigators believed Arlen was deciding whether Harlan fit the emotional criteria, and the prolonged observation indicated a likely affirmative. Tension inside the task force rose sharply. Douglas warned that they were entering the most dangerous phase, the moment just before ritual repetition. If they waited too long, Arlen could attempt to act. If they moved too soon, the case could fall apart without physical evidence. Officers implemented a silent rotation of surveillance around Harlan's home and gym. 2 unmarked vehicles maintained eyes on Arlen's van at all hours. Hale constructed probability models, predicting when the suspect might attempt to initiate direct contact. The atmosphere inside the task force hardened into quiet urgency. Then, on the night of March 23rd, Arlen made a definitive move. At 11:17 p.m., the GPS tracker showed the van leaving Arlen's residence and heading southwest along the interstate. The route aligned exactly with the location of Harlan's gym. Officers scrambled into position as the van entered the darkened streets around the facility. Harlan parked behind the building, near the same rear entrance fighters often used after late training. He stepped out of the van. Surveillance teams watched through nightscopes as the suspect approached the back door of the gym and paused. He placed his hand on the metal handle, then pulled back, glancing toward the parking lot. He stood motionless for several seconds, as if listening. Unbeknownst to him, Harlan had stayed late that night, attempting to train through the emotional fracture left by his defeat. Investigators watched as the gym's interior lights flickered on and off, a sign that Harlan was finishing his routine. When the back door opened, Harlan stepped outside, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, sweat darkening his shirt. Harlan did not move. For a moment, the scene held a chilling stillness. The defeated fighter walking into the night, the suspect standing in the shadow of the building, and the task force holding its collective breath. Then, Harlan took one step forward. That was the moment the task force had been waiting for. Douglas, positioned in a nearby unmarked vehicle, radioed a single word: now. Officers moved in with a precision that had been rehearsed for weeks. 3 vehicles boxed in the van. 2 agents approached Harlan with calm, controlled steps, weapons holstered, hands visible. Harlan froze, expression blank, eyes shifting only slightly toward the officers who emerged from the darkness. He did not run. He did not resist. He seemed almost unsurprised. When they placed him in handcuffs, he looked at the ground as though the weight of the moment was merely another inevitable step in a long ritual he had rehearsed quietly in his mind. Inside the task force, no one celebrated. They had a suspect, but what they needed was a confession, evidence, and ultimately a case strong enough to secure the only acceptable endings within the silent patterns framework: conviction and a definitive sentence. And as investigators soon discovered, capturing Harlan was only the beginning, because what he kept hidden inside his van was about to redefine the entire scope of the investigation. When officers opened the side door of the van that night, the air inside felt unnervingly still, as though nothing in the vehicle had been touched or moved in years. The faint smell of worn upholstery mixed with the residue of cleaning chemicals from Harlan's job. A flashlight beam passed slowly across the interior. Discarded work gloves, a thermos, yellowed receipts, a stack of old arena passes clipped to the visor. It looked, at first glance, like any aging work vehicle that had survived decades of Florida heat. But the investigators had learned through long experience that ordinary surfaces could hide extraordinary secrets. The first significant discovery came in the form of a metal box pushed beneath the passenger seat. It contained a carefully arranged assortment of items: membership cards from gyms scattered across the state, folded fight programs, and small personal objects linked to at least 3 of the missing fighters. Each item had been cleaned, flattened, and stored with meticulous care, as though Harlan had attempted to preserve the emotional residue of the moments connected to his victims. Though not criminal in isolation, the collection formed a psychological mosaic, one that aligned perfectly with the task force's profiler assessments. Detectives continued examining the van. Behind the driver's seat, under a thin carpet covering, they found another concealed compartment. Inside, wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve, was a handwritten notebook. The cover was plain, without markings, but inside were pages containing irregular entries, phrases, notes, observations made at boxing venues across nearly a decade. The writing was sparse, almost cryptic, but certain lines stood out. Loss confirms it, waiting for the fracture. 2 rounds away from truth. He walks alone after defeat. Investigators exchanged glances, aware that although the entries lacked explicit admissions, they displayed a fixation consistent with the pattern of disappearances. This notebook would later serve as circumstantial evidence, strengthening the argument that Harlan had selected his targets based on psychological criteria tied to emotional collapse. At the station, Harlan sat in an interview room under soft fluorescent lighting, hands resting on the table, posture unchanged. His expression remained flat, neither defiant nor distressed. When detectives entered, Douglas, Hale, and 2 others, Harlan looked up briefly, as if acknowledging an appointment he expected, but had not scheduled. He spoke minimally at first. Questions about his routes, his work schedule, and the storage unit were met with quiet, measured responses. When investigators pressed him about the memorabilia, He deflected, claiming he just liked boxing, that he collected things people left behind, and that the items in his storage unit didn't belong to anyone anymore. But the tone of his voice shifted subtly whenever the topic of decisive losses emerged. His eyes drifted downward, his breathing changed rhythm. Hale noted these reactions carefully. Douglas leaned into the psychological angle. He asked not about crimes but about emotion, failure, disappointment, defeat. Arlen's demeanor responded immediately. He sat straighter, eyes focusing on a point in the room no one else could see. "Everyone forgets them after they lose," he said quietly. Everyone looks away. It was not a confession, but it was the first time he revealed the emotional language investigators suspected was at the core of his ritualistic behavior. Over the next several hours, the interrogation followed a slow, deliberate pace. Investigators avoided accusations and instead coaxed Arlen into talking about patterns, why he attended so many fights, why he revisited gyms after defeats, why he kept objects tied to fighters who had disappeared. Arlen spoke in fragments, offering glimpses into a worldview shaped by disappointment and bitterness. He described decisive losses as moments where everything becomes honest, and fighters in that state as men who can't pretend anymore. When Hale asked him directly whether he had ever followed a fighter after a loss, Arlen said, "I watched what others ignored." For the task force, the meaning was clear. But for the court system, these answers remained ambiguous. They needed concrete linkage. Investigators spent days analyzing every item from the van and storage unit. Forensic teams catalogued fibers, prints, and trace evidence. Although no remains were found, consistent with the task force's earlier suspicions that the victims had been transported elsewhere, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence became substantial. Chronological consistency, psychological alignment, and Arlen's proximity to multiple fighters formed a strong narrative, but more was required. A breakthrough arrived through the smallest detail. A single gym membership card belonging to one of the earliest missing fighters, Evan Delacroix, contained a faint partial fingerprint on its underside. The print was smudged and degraded by time, but forensic specialists managed to extract enough markers for comparison. It aligned with Arlen's fingerprints. This was not definitive proof of homicide, but it placed Arlen in physical possession of an item belonging to a man who had vanished under suspicious and consistently patterned circumstances. Combined with the notebook, the memorabilia, the van logs, and the witness sightings from years earlier, prosecutors finally possessed a case strong enough to move forward. In April 1995, Arlen was formally charged, not with murder, which lacked direct physical evidence, but with multiple counts of kidnapping under Florida's historical statutes. This allowed prosecutors to push for severe penalties while the investigation expanded. The courtroom atmosphere during his preliminary hearings felt heavy, as though the proceedings carried the weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions. Families of the missing fighters sat in rows, silent and tense. Some clutched old photographs, others kept their eyes fixed on the defendant, searching for recognition or perhaps closure. Arlen displayed no emotion during the hearings. He watched the proceedings with the same detachment he had shown during surveillance. When the prosecutors laid out the timeline, the patterns, the van sightings, the memorabilia from the storage unit, he blinked occasionally, but otherwise remained motionless. A court-appointed psychologist later described his emotional effect as flat but not confused, a man who understood the gravity of the situation, but saw it as an inevitable endpoint rather than an injustice. The trial itself took months to assemble. Prosecutors constructed a narrative based not on physical remains but on behavioral consistency, psychological evidence, possession of personal objects, and the decades-long pattern that aligned perfectly with Arlen's movements. The defense argued that Arlen was an eccentric collector, that coincidences had been misinterpreted, that the lack of bodies rendered the prosecution's case speculative. But the prosecution countered with forensic testimony, surveillance footage, GPS logs, and expert analysis, illustrating that no other plausible explanation aligned with the evidence. The most compelling testimony came from the forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Porter, who described the psychological architecture of the offender's behavior. She spoke not of violence but of ritual, an offender who targeted fighters experiencing profound emotional collapse, who collected objects tied to their defeats because he identified with their vulnerability, who sought meaning through repetition. Her assessment framed the case not as coincidence but as compulsion. One excerpt from her testimony became widely quoted in later academic discussions. His ritual is not driven by rage or the need for dominance. It is driven by resonance. He seeks men who mirror his internal fracture, those whose identity has imploded under public scrutiny. The memorabilia, the van routes, the discreet observations, all point to a man who found purpose in the vulnerability of others. That testimony shifted the tone of the courtroom. It provided a psychological foundation for understanding how a man like Arlen could operate for nearly 20 years without drawing attention. The jury listened, some leaning forward, some taking notes. The human mind behind the ritual was becoming visible. At the end of the trial, the prosecution presented a final timeline, projected across the courtroom, showing Arlen's presence near the missing fighters at nearly every critical moment of their emotional decline. The map linked locations, losses, van sightings, storage unit items, and eyewitness accounts into a single, cohesive pattern. When the jury deliberated, they took less than 2 days to reach a verdict. Thomas Arlen was found guilty on all counts. But the sentencing phase would determine the outcome that aligned with the silent patterns framework. A definitive, irreversible conclusion that closed the psychological loop investigators had spent years unraveling. And the weight of that decision was about to fall into the hands of the state. The sentencing phase began under a gray Florida sky, the kind of muted weather that gave the courthouse an uncharacteristic stillness. Families of the missing fighters filled the gallery, joined by detectives who had spent years piecing together the fragmented truth behind the disappearances. Though the trial had ended with a conviction, the weight of the unsolved absences remained suspended in the air. Finality, yet not closure. Florida's sentencing laws in the mid-1990s allowed the court to impose the most severe penalties in cases involving long-term predatory behavior, even without physical remains, provided the pattern of abductions was indisputable. Prosecutors argued that Arlen's methods, psychological fixation, and possession of personal belongings represented a prolonged, systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals across nearly 2 decades. They requested the harshest allowable sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The defense attempted one final argument, that without direct physical evidence, the imposition of a life sentence was disproportionate. But the presiding judge, a seasoned jurist familiar with complex psychological cases, emphasized that the law allowed for the interpretation of long-term behavioral evidence when corroborated by substantial circumstantial proof. She acknowledged the absence of remains, but noted that the consistency of Arlen's actions, combined with his possession of personal items belonging to the missing fighters, eliminated any reasonable alternative explanation. Before delivering the sentence, she invited Arlen to speak. He rose slowly, hands cuffed, expression unchanged from the day of his arrest. He looked forward, not at the families, not at the judge, but somewhere beyond them, toward a fixed point only he could see. They were already gone, he said quietly. People look away when a man loses everything. His voice did not waver. He sounded not remorseful, but resigned, as though he had merely articulated a conclusion he believed the world refused to acknowledge. The courtroom remained silent. Some of the families leaned forward, trying to decipher his words, seeking clarity where none existed. Psychologists would later interpret his statement as a reflection of his internal worldview. He saw himself not as a perpetrator, but as an observer of collapse, drawn to emotional fractures he recognized within himself. The judge read the sentence with deliberate calm. Thomas Arlen, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections. There was no sound in the room for several seconds. Then a quiet exhale from someone in the gallery, someone who had been holding their breath for nearly 20 years. Arlen did not react. The bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom, his steps slow, steady, and without visible emotion. It was as though the entire proceeding had unfolded precisely as he expected, as though he had always assumed his ritual would end in confinement. But for investigators, the end of the trial was only the start of the broader reckoning. The FDLE opened a long-term review of unsolved disappearances across the state, hoping to match patterns that might reveal additional victims. Some cases showed faint alignment, others diverged too far to be connected. The full scope of Arlen's actions would remain uncertain, suspended in the space between evidence and possibility. Hale, who had been the first to notice the pattern years earlier, wrote a memo summarizing the psychological underpinnings of the case. He emphasized that Arlen's ritual was not about the fighter's physical strength, but about the emotional moment when that strength collapsed. That moment, Hale argued, functioned as a mirror for Arlen's inner fracture. The FDLE would eventually compile the case into a training module for future investigators. It became a lesson in recognizing behavioral patterns invisible to traditional investigative methods. Our case that unfolded not through physical clues, but through psychological ones. Emotional vulnerability, repeated ritual, and timing synchronized with decisive losses. As the years passed, Arlen's name faded from public memory. His photograph hung for a time in an FDLE hallway as part of a notable cases board, then was archived. Florida moved on, its boxing culture shifting, evolving, producing new champions and new defeats. But for those who had worked the case, its echoes remained. One of those echoes rested in the Daytona Beach arena, where Terrence Mercer had suffered his decisive loss. During a renovation in the late 1990s, workers discovered an old fight program wedged behind a row of seats. It was faded, creased, covered in dust. On the front page, written faintly in pencil, was a date, one that corresponded precisely to the night Arlen had sat in the bleachers, watching Mercer's performance unravel. Perhaps it had belonged to Arlen. Perhaps it had been dropped by a spectator. Or perhaps it was just another coincidence lost in the noise of history. Investigators could never say with certainty. But the symbolism of the discovery lingered. Even after his arrest, the remnants of Arlen's ritual still lay scattered across Florida's arenas. Years later, Hale would reflect on the case during an FDLE lecture. He told new recruits that they must learn to see what others overlooked. That patterns often began not with dramatic evidence, but with quiet consistencies. That the human mind left trails far more revealing than footprints. He paused, then added, "Sometimes the most dangerous individuals aren't the ones who chase chaos. They're the ones who wait for collapse." Arlen died in prison in 1998. Having served only 3 years of his life sentence. The cause was unrelated to his crimes, an internal condition long undiagnosed. His death did not provide closure to the families of the missing fighters, but it marked the final point on the timeline investigators had spent half their careers assembling. The state closed the case officially that year. The file, thick with reports, logs, and psychological analyses, was stored in the FDLE archives with a simple label: Florida Fighter Disappearance Pattern, 1978-1995. A generation later, criminologists would revisit the case as one of the rare examples of a psychological pattern serial offender whose methods revealed almost nothing about his physical actions, but everything about his internal fractures. And even after so much time, the final reflection remained the same. In Florida during those 2 decades, the silence around emotional collapse had become the camouflage for one of the most elusive predators in state history. But in the end, silence was not enough, because someone finally listened.